Welcome, everybody, to an interstitial episode to the Homeric Epic podcast. I call these ones Musing on Homer because I like bad jokes. Anyways, today I have a couple of listener questions from online on Substack. I always love it when people reach out because one, it lets me know I'm not just shouting off into space for no reason. It's nice to hear that people enjoy the podcast and are as equally interested in these poems as I am, which is pretty cool to see, I think. So Jessica had two really good questions. We'll go over her two really good questions, and then I'm going to talk about a book I've been reading on Homer for a while now, a foundational text called The Singer of Tales by Albert Lord, and I'm going to get into that. But first, we'll go on to these questions by Jessica. Her first question is a doozy. It's a huge one. I'm not qualified to answer it. People have probably done entire PhDs on it. I bet there's multiple competing schools of thought for it. But it's basically in the concept of classical reception is there's been a lot of intervening time between ancient Greece and Rome and the present day. And every society that has studied them or received their texts or their knowledge or whatever has received it in a certain way, and they've done their own stuff with it. They interpreted it certain ways. They riffed on it. They ad-libbed it. They did it up and down in their own unique styles and stuff. But her question is, how is Homer the foundation of the Western canon? And I'm doing my air quotes. But also, I think in general, how is Homer foundational for literature, for philosophy, for, classics in general? Right? It's a big question, and you could take it in so many different ways. Like I said, not super qualified to answer this, but I thought about it for a bit, and I noticed I think there's a two-pronged approach to my explanation here. And the first prong is Homer is foundational because it is the bedrock for classical Greek thought. And then classical Greece is the bedrock for the Renaissance. And from there, you can see how it's connected. And so what do I mean if we go back to the very bottom layer of bedrock? Homer is the bedrock for classical Greek thought. What evidence do we have for this? Why can I think that I can justify this, right? So here's a few anecdotes that I think hammer it home. The ancient Athenians love their plays. Lots of the plays are still performed today. I've read nearly all of them. Some of them are hilarious. Some of them are so bloody tragic. They had to invent a word called tragedy to describe them, and they nailed it. It's so sad. So they had lots of these famous playwrights, lots of these festivals every year, and people would come from far and wide to see these plays. And literally, like, the plays are quoted in other ancient writings, like we quote Star Wars, right? Like, everybody knew them. They were just, in the culture. You're swimming in Aeschylus, Euripides, Sophocles. The first major playwright to kind of really reinvent the game, Aeschylus, called the father of tragedy, he was recorded as saying that his plays were simply just slices from the banquet of Homer. And if you kind of think about this, like there's only one extant play that we have that is an episode from the Iliad. The playwrights tended to avoid, it seems, I mean, maybe they didn't, but all the plays we have, they tended to avoid events that are actually depicted in the Iliad and Odyssey. Now, I have to double check if that's because they never did it or we just never have it. I would venture to say it's because they never did it. They didn't want to imitate Homer too closely, or the audience knew it already, and why try and measure up against the greatest, right? So when Aeschylus says his plays are the slices from the banquet of Homer, it means sort of that he's taking the inspiration and the style from this and that, the emotions, the tragedy, the characterizations, and all he's doing is taking a little bit at a time and delivering a play. And obviously the plays are much shorter than either the Iliad or the Odyssey. But it speaks to the praise and the sort of awe that they held Homer in, at least for this genre that they were developing, that they were inventing, right? Because comedy and tragedy are Greek words, and that's where a lot of the play tradition comes from, is ancient Athens. So that one, I always love that one. That one is a good example of that. The other one is Mr. Plato. Mr. Plato, for all his detesting of the Homeric epics and his, expulsion of them from his perfect republic, he is the most prolific quoter of Homer. And like in all the dialogues, all his characters are having little quips from Homer, like, oh, when Achilles said this, when Hector did this, or Ajax, in one of the dialogues, I think it's the Alcibiades. Alcibiades is talking to Socrates, and he says, oh yeah, just like my ancestor Ajax, right? Like an offhanded little anecdote like that Plato includes in his dialogues, which are extremely well constructed and technical in their framing and their symbolism. To have Alcibiades, justify his lineage by reaching back to a character from Homer, I think is pretty telling for the impact that it had on the society, but then also the impact that it had on Plato's writing as well. Like, he can't ignore this author. He can't ignore him, so he can't ignore the influence of Homer so much that he has to account for it when he tries to devise his perfect city. So I always think that, Plato doesn't like Homer. I think he certainly liked Homer, but if he's making philosophical arguments with a justification for how he wants to design his city, then he can't ignore Homer. There was also another anecdote about Plato, where a scrap of, I heard this on a different history podcast, but a scrap of papyrus was found that talked about Plato rewriting his lines in his dialogues until they sounded nice. And it's true in the Greek, if you kind of read it, Plato makes the Greek sound like poetry. And there's theories that, he was so well versed in Homer that it kind of bled into the style of his writing a little bit, which is like, you can't get away from him that easily, Plato. So there's another anecdote. So then, like I mentioned, lots of historical figures claim descent from the Homeric heroes. I should have looked up a list of all the famous ancient classical Greek historical people that claim descent from the Homeric heroes, but it's a lot. I know Alcibiades, Socrates for sure, and I think almost every other major leading politician tried to connect themselves to the Homeric epics in some way. But the one I wanted to mention is Alexander the Great. Obviously, there's a bunch of anecdotes that, if we take half of them to be true, or if we take all of them to be false, but a grain of truth within them, right? It's always tricky with Alexander because he's so enigmatic in who he actually was. But there's anecdotes about him sleeping with a copy of the Iliad under his pillow, which obviously is ridiculous because it wasn't a book, it was scrolls, and there would have been 24 scrolls. So he would have had to have a gigantic pillow. It's just silly. But the fact that this sort of thing is attributed to him is telling of his respect for Homer. There's also, not even to mention, he goes to Troy. Him and Patroclus leave the main body, or him and Hephaestus, his closest companion, leave the main body of the army as they travel through modern-day Turkey. And they take a detour to Troy, and they go visit this ancient temple of Achilles, and the priests there are like, oh, look, these are Achilles' old arms and armor. And he's like, oh, don't mind if I do. And he just takes them. And him and Hephaestus are said to have oiled up naked and run races like the funeral games for Patroclus. And so the fact that Alexander the Great is going out and LARPing his favorite hero is crazy. Because if you look at his campaigns with the knowledge of this in your mind, then he's really just trying to reconstruct himself as a Homeric hero. And this is something you'll encounter when you read about Alexander. It's like, there's definitely the case to be made that he's like searching for the glory and greatness that Achilles achieved. And as we know, Alexander the Great did a few things Few things conquered, few things named after him. Little bit influential overall, I'd have to say. And so I'd like to see within the influence of Alexander, there's a strong influence of Homer. So that one I always like, and I've always wanted to do an episode on just the influence of Homer on Alexander the Great. I think there's enough there to do something pretty cool. The last anecdote I wanted to bring up is a very concrete one, and I had to double check it on one of my favorite blogs, Sententia Antiquae. It's an ancient Greek blog by a professor of classical studies from Brandeis University down in the States, Joel Christensen. He's incredible. All his stuff is amazing on Homer and classical Greece and whatnot. But the details of this was back in classical Athens, the original lawgiver, semi-mythical guy, Solon. He was a real person, lots of myths attributed to him. But Athens and Megara, a town 20, 30 miles away, were having dispute over who owned the island of Salamis. And Salamis is in the sea just west of Athens and prosperous enough that both the towns were vying for control over it. And it was said that by some later authors that Solon actually edited the Iliad, the catalog of ships, to change the troops of the Salamis contingent under the control of Athens. And then he changed the Iliad, and then he brings this changed example to court where it was being arbitrated by a third party. And he says, hey, look, in the past, which we all believe to be real, right? That goes without saying that, that's why he's using this. In this past that we all agree to be real, Athens controlled Salamis. So therefore, we should control it in the present day. And of course, the Megarians actually did the same thing because they were saying that troops from their land in the catalog of ships in the Iliad were led by Ajax, and thus Ajax from Salamis. And so that means that Ajax and Megara, the other city, they're actually together, and the Megarians should own Salamis or control it or whatever. And this is telling to me, and this is part of a larger concept that I have regarding the Homeric epics, is that people in the past treated them like they were real history, or as much real history as could exist, because they didn't have the sort of scientific history that we had today. Obviously, that was sort of invented by Herodotus and Thucydides, but you can see them using the text because it has this much authority, this much influence over their collective psyche that they would use it in legal battles. Like, it's very telling. And I think, obviously who controlled Salamis back in the day probably didn't have any massive historical ramifications, but I think it speaks to how the text did actually function and exist in their minds back then, and how influential it was. Right? No matter how small, it did change the world in this regard very concretely for some group of people. So I always love that example. Okay, rambled on enough about that, but those are some examples off the top of my head about how Homer is influential in classical Greece. And then I'll let you do your own research on how classical Greek thought is influential on today. Spoiler alert, it's a tiny little itty-bitty bit, not much at all, honestly, to understate that a little bit. So the answer to Jessica's first question, is Homeric epics are foundational because they're arguably the oldest literature we have, and I'm doing air quotes again around literature. They're the oldest literature that has been widely read in the West, in Europe, and North America. They're not the oldest, though. There is older literature out there, Epic of Gilgamesh, and very interestingly, the Australian Dreamtime stories, which if you go read the Wikipedia page on those, fascinating. They're older, but they were not as widely read. Epic of Gilgamesh was not translated until, 18th or 19th century, and then it was not widely read, right? So the influence that Homer has been pervasive throughout the years, right? He's been there since the beginning. These stories were read since 600 BC and widely known in lots of societies. They were used as teaching guides. Little school kids copied out different bits of Homer onto little pottery shards to learn their letters when they were young. So here's kind of what I came up with for how it's influential in just literature. First off, it created the epic genre, which has been imitated by poets like many, many times over. And this is because it's the first widely read epic. So you read this story and oh my God, I need to make a story just like it. The prime example of this is the Roman poet Virgil. He basically copies Homer extremely closely with his Aeneid. And the Aeneid then became the standard text to learn Latin throughout the Middle Ages because the church used Latin. How are you going to learn Latin? Well, you need a big example of Latin. That's the Aeneid. In the Middle Ages, honestly, the Homeric epics were not as popular. They were recorded. Obviously, we have them, so monks copied them down and stuff. But the Aeneid was much more popular throughout the Middle Ages, more widely read. And the Aeneid, it developed some literary devices that were present in Homer and just took them to the next level. And then Dante came along and he riffed off of Virgil. And interestingly enough, in Dante's his Inferno, Dante's Inferno, Homer makes an appearance. He's in the very first circle of hell, which is the part that isn't so bad. It's where all the good pagans go. So I think it speaks to the respect that Dante had for Virgil, and then that Dante could detect Virgil had this respect for Homer. Ovid draws on Homer a lot. I'm definitely an Ovid amateur, but a quick Google search reveals like entire books talking about the Homeric influence in Ovid, like not a small bit at all kind of thing. One interesting thematic bit that was invented by Homer is the underworld scene. Sorry, I won't say invented by Homer, popularized by Homer. And there's a clear string connecting the underworld scene from the Odyssey to Virgil, to Dante, and then to Christianity. You can absolutely make the case that the modern notions of hell are related to Dante's Inferno, which is related to the Aeneid, which is related to the Odyssey. There's a non-negligible influence there. So that's pretty cool. I've always found that very interesting. And lastly, I think the Iliad and Odyssey were influential not just because of their content, but because of how many people studied them so closely. Like I mentioned, they're pottery shards from ancient Greece showing school children copying down them to learn rhetoric. Scholars in the Library of Alexandria, oh man, they left so many notes in the margins of Homer, and it was poured over for understanding and learning for so long. There is a series of books by one professor, and I'd love to read them one day. Unfortunately, they're low on my priority list of books to buy, but it's connecting the influences of the Homeric epics to the Gospels, because the Gospels of the New Testament are written in Koine Greek. And how would you learn Greek if you don't know Greek? Well, you need a big corpus of Greek, and guess what? You would use the Iliad and the Odyssey, or it was thought that you would. So there's lots of passages in the Gospels that they notice are very similar in their wording, similar in their symbolism to scenes from the Iliad and Odyssey. And now I won't venture to say what that has about authenticity or whatever. I just think it's also a non-negligible impact. And well, heck, I'll tie it back around to the historical example here. The reason the Gospels are written in Greek is because of Alexander the Great conquering the region 300 years before, and then his predecessors, the Diadochoi, them fighting it out over the region, and finally Rome taking control of it and using the lingua franca of Greek, which they were already masters of, to just administer the region, and it became the language of scholars. And then heck, when you want to write down some cool stories in that area, you use Greek for it. So there's just a little bit, just a tiny little bit about how influential the Iliad and Odyssey are. I have yet to find a good book that sums it all up. It might be because that's too big. I don't know. But if I do find a good book on it, I'll let you know. The next excellent question from listener Jessica was, what was the attitude of women in Homeric Greece towards being a war prize? And her context comes from the Iliad, which unfortunately there's not too much female presence in the Iliad compared to the Odyssey. But Helen in book 3 seems a bit contemptuous of her being stolen away. She's not exactly a war prize, but she's somewhat adjacent to one. Andromache in book 6 really dreads being some war prize for some Achaean soldier. But Briseis, strangely, seems to be genuinely unhappy to be taken away from Achilles in book 1. In book 18, when Achilles and Patroclus's slaved women are mourning over Patroclus, if they're the same mind as Andromache, they would have thought they'd be happy that Patroclus is dead. So our question is, what is their attitude of towards being claimed as war prizes in the Iliad? And now we got to do the caveat that, obviously the Trojan War and stuff is fictional. Some parts of it reflect realities of Bronze and Iron Age Greece, but not all of it. At the end of the day, it is literature. So to these points individually that she brought up, especially Helen is a very complex character, and it doesn't seem so at first glance. She's one of the few characters that, has a decent speaking role in both the Iliad and the Odyssey. And it's very telling how she ends her story in Greek mythology. She survives the sack of Troy, honestly, which is surprising. So I've always thought that Helen's motivations are obscured from us. Her true thoughts and feelings we don't have access to them. She has her own agenda, right? Whether she actually wanted to go to Troy, whether Aphrodite made her, I would love to find a copy of the Cypria one day and be able to see what the other poets thought, but we don't know. We don't know if she's just playing a part in Troy that is expected of her, or whether she actually was kidnapped, kind of thing. Other myths show her as tricky as Odysseus is. Scenes in the Odyssey show this, the verbal fencing going on between her and Menelaus, the story she brings up about her walking around the Trojan horse, trying to trick the men inside by imitating the voice of Penelope and whatnot. She's no slouch, right? She's managed to survive this whole time and, do her best in an extremely hostile environment towards her. That's my main point is Helen survives. She does what she needs to do to keep going. And she's not as passive as just a war prize to be owned, because really her existence is an enabling factor for the heroes, right? She's the daughter of Zeus. So Menelaus wants to get her back. All of them want to get her back so bad because to have the daughter of Zeus is extremely valuable, basically. And I don't think that's lost on Helen. Next, the differences between Andromache's situation and the slave girls of Achilles. Firstly, Andromache dreads the capture because of what it would mean for her son and Hector and her city. She knows if she gets captured, it's because all of these events have transpired that have enabled her to be captured, and everybody she knows and loves is dead. So that's not good, right? And we do know after the war that she was forced to marry Achilles' son, Neoptolemus, and bear his child. So that's horrendous. I think, there are a couple of tragic plays. There's one called Andromache, and it's tragic. It's basically where Andromache is in Phthia, and she's treated horribly by everyone around her, especially the old man Peleus, and Neoptolemus. They all treat her like crap, and she's like, what did I do to deserve this, basically? And it's a great tragedy. So now, the slave women of Achilles, yes, they lament Patroclus, but there's a very subtle caveat in the text, and it reads, "And the women in response mourned for the sake of Patroclus, but each mourned for her own cares," end quote. So because they are enslaved people. They have no opportunity, they're not allowed to express their own desires, their own feelings, their own emotions openly at all, right? That's not okay. They just can't do that, right? Because theoretically, these people have no agency. They are property, and Achilles or Patroclus could just kill them. At least that's going off of some of the ways that slaves were treated in ancient Greece, which, remember, this is literature, so it's drawing on different time periods, so we can't say for certain. But if you were to go off of kind of a template from ancient Greece, then that would be the response. They would not be allowed to show their own emotions. So while maybe they liked Patroclus a bit because he's not as bad as the other people, maybe he was genuinely kind. The text certainly explicitly says so, that Patroclus was genuinely kind. But really, their lamentations here are just a cathartic opportunity for them that they would otherwise not get. The situation calls for them to be crying, right? Their master's beloved has been slain, and everyone should cry in the household because that'd be the appropriate thing to do. And so, hey, this is your time to cry and to mourn your fate. Pretty good time to do it because everyone's got to be crying anyways. That's the explanation I heard that jives the best for me, because otherwise, I don't know if they cried when Achilles died, or we don't know, but maybe they did because they had to, but it might have been like, oh, phew, that jerk is dead, right? Obviously, we can't say without a source. But I think that this shows the attitude to being captured in war is that which Andromache has. It means the extinction of your life and the beginning of brutal subjugation for women. So obviously, the ancient world famously not too kind to women in war, and the Iliad certainly captures that. And I think it's really part of the raw emotion of the story. It's the tale of a city under siege that's happened 1,000 times before the Iliad and will happen 1,000 times after it. And that makes the stakes so high for Hector, for Paris, for all the Trojans. And it really makes the weight so much more when you hear about Andromache's plight and whatnot. Like, it's one of my favorite scenes by far. So, yeah, that would probably be my answer to what the attitude of women to being enslaved or war prizes is in Homeric Greece or the Iliad. So thank you to Jessica for these great questions. It was super fun to ponder them. Always looking forward to more questions. So just drop me a line on Substack or email or something. Send me some snail mail. Not going to give you my address though. That's no problem. So for the final section of this already long episode, I'm surprised I was able to ramble on this long enough, but know what? I shouldn't be surprised because it happens too often. I wanted to talk about this book, The Singer of Tales by Albert Lord. And so in the podcast, I think I've mentioned it before in episode 1 and briefly throughout, but it relates to the concept of the Iliad and Odyssey as traditional oral poetic poems. And to say this is foundational to the Iliad and Odyssey is like saying relativity is foundational to physics. When this work came out by Milman Parry and Albert Lord, it just turned the understanding, the conceptualization of the poems on their head. They became something completely different. We had to look at them in a new way. And it's very hard to state how influential this is, but let me try. So the book contains the work of Milman Parry and Albert Lord, and what they wanted to do was observe oral poets in rural Yugoslavia. The reason they had to go there was Yugoslavia was known to have an existing oral tradition of poets who were illiterate, but the book calls them unlettered, which I like much more. Unlettered poets who composed their songs in performance. They did not write the song beforehand. They did not practice the song beforehand. They got up on the stage and they created the song. And what they noticed when they got there and they started, recording these poets, asking them to make tales like this, asking them to repeat tales, asking them, 1 month from now, we're going to ask you the same tale, and recording that. They ask multiple poets to make the same tale, and they note the differences between them. And they amass this collection of truly scientific experimentation of these oral poetics. And they proved incontrovertibly that the Iliad and Odyssey were stories of this type, by which I mean they were originally composed in performance on the fly by poets. And the work sets out to prove this, and it knocks it out of the park. Like I mentioned, this is a very foundational concept in the Homeric studies and whatnot. And the book is great. I need to digest it more and put it down in a better form than me doing so right now. But the things I wanted to say, at least in this first little bit that I touch on it, is it's such a cool situation in the humanities where something was proved in such an experimental way. The only way I could kind of describe how impactful it was and how important this is was the Albert Einstein example. Before Einstein, people had ideas about physics, but then he comes along and he does some math and he goes, no, wait, stuff's actually like this. And it goes on to blow everybody's minds, and they have to look at the universe in a totally different way. And then it all gets confirmed with experiments later on, right? And that's Einstein's influence. And what Perry and Lord did was arguably more impressive and impactful for their respective field, the humble field of Homeric epic poetry, because Perry had the hypothesis, and then he set out to prove it immediately. And he basically blew the whole thing wide open, and there are gargantuan mountains of evidence in favor of his theory. So I want to use these Musing on Homer episodes to expound a bit on this book, because there's so many good examples of how different oral poetry is from literature and our sort of, literate conceptualization of poetry. One quick example to leave off on is when they're recording these bards and they're asking them, oh, do you mind stopping there? You said something interesting about the hero, about the story, blah, blah, blah. Can you repeat that line? So they ask this guy, can you repeat that line? And he goes, what do you mean? And they're like, well, just say that line again. And they're translating it for sure. But he doesn't know what they mean. This guy is illiterate, unlettered, and asking him to repeat a line. Think about that. That doesn't make sense unless you know writing. A line has no meaning in the context of speech. They explain the concept to him, and he goes, oh, well, that's a bit weird. I don't know what to think about that. And he repeats it, but he doesn't get the quote-unquote line of poetry, the simple metrical repetition that when they put it on the page is one horizontal bar, right? That's not how they think of it. And there's a whole couple of pages in this book where Albert Lord just talks about our language that we use to describe poetry. It's insufficient to describe what these bards are doing. They're doing things that we don't have words for, basically. And a lot of the text is devoted to just being like, I'm going to call it this, but it actually means all of this. Like the example, oral poetics, right? It's not reciting poetry that is pre-composed. It is a traditional way of generating, composing, and performing poetry all at once. It's like you're a singer-songwriter who only does improv and doesn't know how to read and doesn't write anything down. And that has like huge implications for the form of the tales, the shapes of the tales, just so much. It is absolutely fascinating. And the book that I have, the copy that I have, is already getting hard to close with all the little sticky notes I'm putting inside it. So I'm very excited to dive into that some more and bring that to you guys because, it's a doozy for how we need to think about these stories and all that. Okay, I have droned on long enough. I'll leave it at that. I'm hoping to have the next episode finished in a month because, as some of you might be aware from my last episode, I said I was having a baby and the baby came a little early. So I've been on paternity leave. It's been very fun changing diapers, but I love the little goober, so that's a lot of fun. And I've got 4 more weeks off, so I'm going to speed write episode 17 on Iliad 16, which I know is going to be a long book. There's lots to say about Patroclus's Aristeia and the connections it has to Achilles. So hopefully I can finish that and record that before I go back to work, because that would be awesome. So until then,